that is exactly how, for instance, a large language model works. It takes society, digital society, all of the traces that we leave behind. And remember, recording has now become the default mode of society. So it takes all of these digital traces, our digital ancestors, and collapses them into what strikes us as a singular presence. But in both cases, it's an illusion. We think that we're interacting with a single intelligent agent, but what we're interacting with is really our collective past.
Welcome back to the AI Governance Podcast. Most often in this show, we talk about the governance requirements of the present and the future that AI looks set to deliver. But today we're asking an older question. What happens to us when we're gone? In the age of AI, we don't just leave behind memories and heirlooms, we leave behind informational bodies, vast trails of search histories, health data, and voice recordings. Our guest today is one of the world's leading experts on what happens to that data. Dr. Karl Öhman is an associate senior lecturer at Uppsala University and the author of the 2024 book, The Afterlife of Data. He has spent years researching the digital afterlife industry, a world where the dead may soon outnumber the living on our social platforms and where AI can literally reanimate our loved ones as chatbots. Karl, it's absolutely fascinating to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me on the show.
No, we're delighted. So, Karl, I have so many questions for you, but perhaps it's best if I open things up for you to introduce yourself and how you came to this topic.
So, as you mentioned, I'm a senior lecturer in political science at Uppsala University, Sweden. But that's in name only. I actually never studied political science. I describe myself as a disciplinary orphan. And if people push me on that, I say that I'm a sociologist who was raised by analytical philosophers. So I was always very interested in the internet, but I did my BA in sociology and comparative literature. Ended up at the University of Oxford at the Oxford Internet Institute, where I did my master's and PhD. And the title of both of those degrees are like sound made up. The master's is Master in Social Science of the Internet, but people just calls it a Master of the Internet degree. And my PhD is in Information Communication in the Social Sciences, which basically means do whatever you want as long as it's about the internet. And when it was time for me to apply for positions when I was done with my PhD, I could plausibly frame myself to fit into most of the social sciences. But I found this wonderful position specifically on AI and political communication in Uppsala. So I've been here ever since.
Excellent. Okay, so if we dive in, I mean, Carl, I think most people think of AI as a tool for the living, but you spent your career so far looking at the digital graveyard. So how did you find yourself at that intersection of Silicon Valley and the afterlife?
It's true that a lot of people, when they hear about this subject of, dead people emerging online generally, but also the connection between the dead and AI, it strikes them almost like an anomaly. It's like a curious, interesting thing that it's like, oh, hang on a minute, like the dead shouldn't be online. And in my book, The Afterlife of Data, but when I speak of this topic generally, I try to turn things on its head. I'm trying to say that we, the living, are really the strangers on the web. Because if you think of it, like, what is the internet? It's a giant archive. And the archives were built for the past. It's our way of storing the past. What is new with the internet is that we, the living, have moved into these structures that we built for the past and for the dead. So we are really the strangers here. And I think the same is true when it comes to AI, that we tend to think of it as this very futuristic technology. And the fact that it's used to emulate the dead feels to many uncanny and strange. But if you look at history, it's the most natural thing in the world, because every new information technology is initially perceived as magic, and it's perceived as something that can penetrate into the spirit world. So, just to give you a few examples,
Yeah.
stone. Like when we started using stone in the early Neolithic, stone was exclusively used to mark the resting places of the dead. Even like if you look at Paleolithic and Neolithic England, um, stone was exclusively reserved for the dead. So Stonehenge, for instance, is
Yeah.
thought to, the stones of Stonehenge were thought to represent the ancestors. And there was a Woodhenge, not that far from it, which represented the gathering place of the living.
Mhm.
Fast forward to the written word, all right? First people we start writing to, dead people. Like the Egyptians would constantly leave letters for the dead because it was thought that the dead could read, but they couldn't hear you speak.
Okay.
If you look at more modern examples like photography, the first thing that we start photographing, dead people.
Yeah.
We start hanging up the pictures of our departed loved ones within our houses. Same with the telegraph. Hundreds of thousands of people trying to communicate with the departed spirits of their ancestors through the telegraph. And now with AI, we're doing it all again, trying to penetrate into the spirit world. So if you zoom out and look at it from a historical perspective, it's not at all surprising.
Yeah. You're making it sound like it was inevitable.
Maybe not inevitable, but certainly not surprising.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's
The
fair.
the, the title of the book was originally going to be The Postmortal Condition. And I was very careful to specify that it was a condition in the sense that none of this, like digital technologies, do not determine the way we relate to the dead, but they
Mhm.
condition that relationship.
No, understood. Okay. So, and if I look at another phrase of yours, or one that I believe you've coined, you talk about our digital remains being informational bodies. I alluded to that right at the top there. So if you'll forgive me, if I think about that informational body, when I'm gone as an heirloom, as something that gets passed on, as something that hits the next generation, if my children inherited a painting from me or from my parents or whatever, it's theirs to do whatever they want with. The original owner's gone, they've moved on, and now it belongs to the next generation. It belongs to the inheritor. But with a digital diary or a search history, for example, that immediately feels different. And I suppose I got caught up in the idea that historians have always struggled to know what ordinary people did with their time, right? They've always been the hardest ones to track, to record what they ate, what their day looked like, and suddenly we're going to have generation upon generation who have all that data. So is that something we should be excited about? That regular people will finally get to be a part of history, or should we be looking at it the other way and terrified that our descendants are going to read our literal search histories and what we looked at online at every age?
Well, I suppose my short answer to that question is yes.
Okay.
We should be excited about the prospect of a truly democratic history. My former supervisor, Luciano Floridi, who was my mentor for many years in Oxford, um, he has this, I think, very astute observation that history used to be shaped by the question, is this person or event important enough to sacrifice resources to record?
Hmm.
What has happened now is that recording has almost become the default mode. Everything is recorded. So the question we're asking is instead, is this unimportant enough to actively destroy?
Hmm.
But as you point out, like the majority of our history is about kings and emperors and powerful men, mostly. Like we don't really even know how slaves lived in ancient Rome because they left so little information behind. But now we're at a point in history where we can sort of actively shape a more democratic history, and we can consciously shape what information we leave behind to future generations. Unfortunately, that question of whom is important for posterity, what is unimportant enough to destroy, that is itself not a question that we have allocated to democratic communities, but we have outsourced that question completely to a handful of tech giants. And these giants recognize no other value of their data than the sheer economic value. And I don't blame them for it. That's the incentives that we've set up as a
Yeah.
society. Um, but long term, we're approaching a very dangerous situation where, you know, a single individual like Elon Musk can determine the fate of every tweet ever written. And that is just like when I lecture about this, I ask people to imagine or to consider the fact that every tweet tweeted during the Me Too movement
Hmm.
is now the private property of Elon Musk, such that
Yeah.
when future historians are going to want to study what went down there in the fall of 2017, what really happened, who participated, what kind of testimonies were there, what kind of allegations, and so on. One person owns that entire narrative.
Hmm.
And yes, like today, we have some means of protesting. Maybe the GDPR allows you to take down those tweets or whatever. But as we move further and further into the future, and more of these people responsible for those tweets are going to be dead, well, there are going to be no means of protesting.
Yeah. I think yeah, one, as you say, one person then holds the key to that entire history.
Yeah, and
And,
like
and
even if
then
that person had been a saint, this would have
Mhm.
been a very dangerous situation,
Yes.
and God knows that is not the case.
Okay. I was trying not to say it, but I'll let you. Yeah. Okay. And well, so by extension, if the majority of the digital data then, as I think you said before, will be from places like India, Indonesia, across Africa, uh, does that mean that we kind of blindly stumble into a data colonialism, where do the Western tech companies become those gatekeepers, that key holder that we've talked about, and then by extension the erasers of the history of the global South potentially?
Yeah, I think that is a very real possibility that, like as you mentioned, there's this study that I and my colleague David Watson did back in 2019, where we uh, project that at some point by the 2060s, there are going to be more dead than alive users on Facebook,
Mhm.
and this is a threat to their very business model, of course, because dead people don't click on any ads.
Yeah.
They take up a lot of server space, nevertheless. So if you're going to have those data centers running, there's going to be some economic incentive to do so. So either they're going to have to remonetize that data to bring our digital remains back into the data economy. And there are a variety of ways in which they can do that, which we can discuss later. But I think a more plausible scenario is that they're going to be forced to start erasing data. And if
Yeah.
I were them, of course, like a North American user is worth, uh, I mean, tens, if not 100 times more than most African users. So it makes sense that you would basically just, from a financial point of view, destroy the digital history of Africa and South Asia and keep that of North America and West Europe
Mhm. Yes,
and
as you
many
say.
parts of Asia as well, of course. But yeah, it's not like one of those immediate risks that we see coming in the next 5 years, but we
Mhm.
can definitely see it on the horizon. It's just that no one really has an incentive to do anything about it right now because politicians, they have a sort of tops 5 year horizon. Um, the tech horizon is also maximum. It's either 5 years or it's like 200 years.
Yeah, and nothing in between. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Um, And then if I can, so taking a very different direction, some of you writing reminded me of a movie from the 90s called Things to Do in Denver Where You're Dead. And the premise of the movie, or the background idea in the movie, was that one of the characters had a business where um, you could record video messages that your ancestors could speak to from the afterlife. And at the time, that was a comedic sci-fi trope. You know, it was a funny background against a dark story. But the reality today, not that far into the future from the 90s, is that grief tech's now a multi-billion-dollar industry. And AI can reanimate people as an interactive bot. You can talk to your deceased relatives. And I suppose my initial reaction to that was it seemed a little hard to imagine. But we spoke recently with Brianna Bellamy from SIPL on the podcast, and she mentioned that about a quarter of the UK uses apps to provide emotional support, companionship, bordering on, psychological or psychiatric help. And then suddenly you realize, well, actually, those concepts aren't so far away. That for a lot of people, they're going to be something very real that they absolutely will use. Um, it doesn't feel like it's a big jump, I suppose, is what I'm saying. So, um, if I look at that through an AI governance lens, do people, is it your experience that people realize that this is happening, or do you feel that we're signing our afterlife away in the terms and services of the updates that realistically, probably very few of us ever actually read? Who owns that in the beyond?
I mean, generally, sadly, my experience is that people have very little knowledge about how much data they actually sign off. And when I tell them that dead people don't have any data privacy rights,
Mhm.
people are shocked. They're like, "What? Really?" But I mean, it says it right in the GDPR. It states very explicitly that these rights cease at the moment you die.
Yeah.
Dead people don't have any data protection rights. I mean, there are some limited rights in some countries, mainly related to inheritance, but in terms of like a right to privacy, that doesn't quite exist. Um, and also, people don't quite realize just how big of a digital shadow they actually cast. When I tell people what my research is about, they often react by saying, "Oh, I don't leave much of a digital presence. Like I rarely upload stuff to social media. I'm a pretty discreet person."
Mhm.
And I try to remind them that the data that they consciously upload to social media sites, for instance, that's just a tiny fraction of the digital shadow that they cast. Everything that
Proactive stuff.
you Google, everything like just walking here, my iPhone recorded every step that I took along the way. When I was working for a summer in Norway in a kind of remote mountain station, and I realized that all my people you may know that came up on Facebook
Mhm.
were hikers that I'd walked past. Um, and since we were the only people within that proximity,
Mhm.
um, of course, the algorithm picked up that these people must know each other because,
There's no
like, the
one else
chances of
around.
them not
Yeah.
running into each other is very low. And that's when you realize, like, just how much a digital presence or shadow you actually cast. So, short answer, no, people have very little knowledge of this.
Mhm. No, of course. And I mean, I suppose we're talking there about, we're talking about the rights of the dead, and there's a question as well, again, but sticking with the governance perspective on it. I can't help but question how much consent you can give around that, even when you're living. So, if I give my consent to be turned into an AI bot after I'm gone, I don't know how informed that is, because
Mm,
I can't sign off or agree to what that, the LLM that's doing it will say in my name. How can I? I don't know what it's really going to be used for or where that goes. So,
yeah. Yeah. I mean, I wrote about this in the first study I published on this subject back in 2017, even. This was like one of the immediate issues that struck me as very concerning because the quality of chatbots was evolving at just a breakneck speed. So if you signed up to one of these services in 2017, you would have signed up to a service that was nowhere near passing the Turing test, or, it wouldn't have struck you as interacting with a real human. Um, Fast forward 5 years, this is something that we do every day. And I don't think anyone could, or very few people could have anticipated how fast that development would be. Um, and that's not like you can't really sign up for that. You sign up for a service as it is
As
performing
is.
right
Yeah.
now,
Yeah.
but it's very hard to take into account what it may look like, may or may not look like in a couple of years. And that's not only one dimensional in the sense of like, oh, the service will get better, but it may change in all kinds of ways. The way that you are portrayed by a service now may not be the same as you will in 4 or 5 years, depending on how they shift the weights and depending on what hard rules that they're going to code into it.
Yeah. Okay.
It's if you allow me to just drop a funny anecdote of the app Replica, which they're branding as kind of like train your AI best friend that you can confide in. But of course, people use it for sexting. So, they create their like a sexual partner, AI
Okay.
partner. Um, and I suppose they didn't want to, like, that's not how they branded themselves. So just ahead of Valentine's Day, is it 3 years ago or something now? They changed the algorithm so that these avatars couldn't engage in any dirty talk. And people went completely outraged. They were like, "You have killed my lover. The experience has completely changed. I worked for years on this chatbot." So what they did was that a lot of users went onto Reddit, and this was just after ChatGPT 4 came out. Um, and they took their entire chat logs with their bots, their
Mhm.
replica bots, and they fed it into ChatGPT 4 and they asked it to replicate this personality. So
Yeah.
they sort of digitally resurrected the
Yes.
AI avatar that wasn't really alive in the first place.
They migrated an artificial consciousness to another
Yeah,
platform,
it's
effectively. Yeah.
it's pretty funny.
Oh, wow. And I mean, funny as that is, the thing that's jumping out at me there is, we're talking about this as a we're talking about this as an afterlife business. So if somebody gets that attached to something that they know that
Yeah.
they've created, that they know to be artificial, that level of attachment to something that's built off a personality of a deceased relative is going to be, yeah, exponentially
Yeah,
stronger
in a
than
way,
fear.
it's like
So,
the ultimate product because you have already chosen your loved ones.
mhm.
So if someone can replicate that and sell it back to you, not only is it like a product that you have, or product in quotation mark,
Yeah,
that you've chosen yourself, but it's also a product that continues to advertise itself. And, you wouldn't shut me down, right? We have this beautiful relationship going on. So it's almost, there's a risk that you would sort of keep people's relationships hostage, that you're turning their loved ones or turning their loved for their next of kin or their family members, almost taking that hostage and turning it into um, an economic motor.
of course. Yeah, they've lost them once. They're not going to choose to
Yeah,
switch them off a second time. Yeah,
exactly.
absolutely. Absolutely. Okay, so in a similar but slightly different vein, I'm working as a marketer in the AI space, so I know what the search data looks like. I know what draws the traffic, for in general reasons and for business reasons too. So one term that's massive, as a search term, oftentimes for dark reasons, is the term deep fake. And you've written about something that I'd love us to get into for a moment, called the pervert's dilemma regarding
Hmm.
deepfakes identity. So can you take a moment and explain that for us? Because as I look at it, it feels like our moral gut feeling that making a fake of someone is wrong, um, is arguably light years ahead of the actual laws, and especially when the person's deceased, and as you know, as we've touched on earlier, they can't be defamed anymore. Those rights are gone.
Mm.
So can you expand on that for us a little and explain that concept?
Yeah, so this is something I started working on as I was exploring these AI avatar resurrection of the dead sites. Um, and I realized that there's a sort of dark aspect of this phenomenon, which is pornography. That almost immediately when deepfake technology became widely accessible, the key driver of that technological development was making porn videos. So, superimposing someone's face onto a pornographic video. And rightly, I think a lot of people were upset about this or are upset about this. And back then in 2019, there was a sort of moral panic around this.
Yeah.
And one thing that I realized was that, say that you had a private app where you could basically, a generative AI app, and you could tell it to display any scene of your imagination with a caveat that you could never share it with anyone. So it was only like a private fantasy machine. I think we would have a gut feeling that it would be morally wrong to create a deep fake about someone you know without their consent,
Yeah.
even if you couldn't share it with anyone. Now, I think that gut feeling is justified, but hear me out. It's very difficult to articulate a morally significant distinction between that and a sexual fantasy in your head.
Hmm.
Because your brain is performing a very similar function to the generative AI. It takes input and it generates something new, a new image of that input. And remember, like, yes, you can ruin someone's reputation by sharing the video, and there can be a sort of public shaming kind of aspect to it. But if we look at it just as a contained practice, I think still there's a paradox, what I call the perverse dilemma, in that we think that sexual fantasies are perfectly morally permissible, whereas deepfakes are not.
Hmm.
Uh, I think that there's a way we can solve this dilemma. Not all people are equally convinced that I've actually solved it, but
Okay.
it has generated a lot of debates on both sides as to whether there is a morally significant difference between sexual fantasies and deepfakes.
Yeah. Okay. And it's just it's such a huge discussion, but it's one that has to be had. It,
Yeah,
it's
it
the
it
reality.
is, and I think a lot of the times we get this gut feeling that something is wrong, and then we just take it and run with it. Um, but I think it's important that we stop and that we really try to articulate why something is wrong before we begin to um, combat it with different regulatory means,
Mhm.
because chances are that we'll miss the target. Or that we will begin, that miss the target in the sense that we're not regulating the thing that should be regulated,
Yeah.
but the thing that we can regulate. Or we miss the target in the sense that we go too far, that we, open a door that we don't necessarily want to open up, such as regulating people's imagination.
Yes. Yeah. Absolutely. Okay. So, look, I've gone in a lot there to what you've been working on for the last few years. I have to ask you what's next? What are you working on now, and what's coming up for us? Because it's just it seems like an endless subject.
Hmm. Well, so as I'm sure you can already tell, I do have a taste for these big topics,
Mhm.
death and porn and stuff. And my new my new book does not disappoint in that regard. It's the title is Gods of Data: An Atheist Critique of AI. So it's an idea that started with a work on my previous book, and the argument here is that AI systems are gods. Um, Now, what's a god? In a theological sense of the word, a god would be a supernatural being beyond space and time, and that's nothing like AI. Now, in an anthropological sense of the word, a god would be a personification of the authority of society over the individual. So the idea here is that religion originally emerged as a kind of worship of the ancestors as the source of wisdom and knowledge. But with time, the ancestors become too many, and too temporally removed, so they collapse into a singular presence, the presence of the divine. And that can either be represented as a single almighty God, or it could be represented as a pantheon of gods, which are usually the multiple faces of the single presence. Now, that is exactly how, for instance, a large language model works. It takes society, digital society, all of the traces that we leave behind. And remember, recording has now become the default mode of society. So it takes all of these digital traces, our digital ancestors, and collapses them into what strikes us as a singular presence. But in both cases, it's an illusion. We think that we're interacting with a single intelligent agent, but what we're interacting with is really our collective past.
Yeah,
You know, when you're chatting with ChatGPT, you are literally chatting with the internet.
yeah.
Now, why do I make this argument beyond the fact that it's cool and works? It's because this move allows me to mobilize the entire tradition of religious critique, which is arguably the richest tradition of Western philosophy. Um, and I mobilize it as a critique of AI instead. And it works just absolutely flawlessly.
It's a perfect fit.
I mean, it works really well. There are just so many areas of application. There are so many similarities that when I started doing it, I couldn't believe no one else had done it before. And just to give you a sense of the types of arguments that I'm interested in here is that
Mhm.
if you look at the AI ethics debate today, 98% of it is about various flaws in the machine. The AI is black box, it's unpredictable or unreliable. What if it takes over and kills us all? And these are really about just optimization, rectifying flaws in our systems.
Yeah,
But the tradition of religious critique allows us to do something else because it's not about the fact that God is not real. It says that even if God were real, it wouldn't be desirable for us humans to be with God for various reasons. Now, by analogy, I can say the same thing. Well, let's say that AI was perfect. It was always right. It could always predict the future. It could always give us exactly what we wanted. Wouldn't there still be something lost in a life where we outsourced every human decision to these perfect machines? And I think that the tradition of religious critique allows us to articulate exactly what those losses are, and that's what my new book is about.
okay, excellent. I'm looking forward to that. I think we could possibly extract a whole other level of governance out of that one as well. So, fantastic, Colin. Thank
Happy
you
to be
so
back
much.
in a year when it's published.
No, perfect. I look forward to it, and I'll hold you to that. So look, that's been a really eye-opening conversation for me. And I mean, we often talk about AI in terms of milliseconds, in terms of immediate outputs. And I think you've reminded us that, the data we create today is actually a first draft of a global encyclopedia that people
Yeah.
will read in the future. And it's a lot to process. So it's been refreshing that we're not talking about AI taking jobs so much as AI taking our history. I think is
Mm,
the way I would look at that. Um, and I think we have to move past that idea that the digital debt or a legal technicality to be managed by a service level agreement. There's an awful lot more at stake. So
yeah.
look, thank you so much for coming on the show, and helping us see those long-term stakes.
Well, thank you for having me.
No, really appreciate it. And for everyone listening, I highly recommend picking up Carl's book, The Afterlife of Data. As I think we've shown today, it'll definitely change how you look at every search you make and every photo you upload, and well, yeah, every beat of your heart and step you take, as you pointed out, Carl. We're followed all around. As we've discussed today, 2026 has become the year where AI governance finally meets long-term digital preservation. And if we want the historians of the 22nd century to have a fair and representative record of who we are, the work starts with the regulations that we write today. You can find links to Carl's work and his latest research at Uppsala University in our show notes. And if the episode made you think differently about your own informational body, please share it with a friend or colleague. I'm Matt McCallum, and we'll be back next time with more from the AI Governance Podcast. Until then, be mindful of the traces you leave behind. Thanks, Carl.
Awesome.